Welcome back to Crude X, Season 3, about the Candyman, Dean Corll, and the Houston mass murders. This is a follow-up to our last episode about men who produced child exploitation material and ran sex trafficking rings. The reason for this deep dive is the belief by many that Dean Corll was a part of it as well. We are working our way through the research to see if that is true. On our last episode, we discussed a man named John David Norman. His is a name to remember. He was a kingpin of the child exploitation industry, a key figure in multiple sex trafficking rings across the United States, California, Illinois, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Louisiana, Florida, and even Texas. His connections included wealthy men. There was a man from Michigan named Francis Sheldon, a man named Dyer Grossman from New Jersey. There was Peter Bradford in Florida, and from Texas and California, you could say, there were these guys. One was named Guy Straight, and then there was his business partner, Billy Byers Jr. So you can listen to all that on our last episode. We went over all those men. All of them participated in either child exploitation material or sex trafficking or both. They were all connected to very powerful people, and they had a lot of money. So on this episode, what we're going to do is bring that in. We're going to be focusing more on what was happening in Texas. Unlike other states where they went after and prosecuted these guys for these things, Texas just didn't pursue it in the same way, which is strange for Texas because we are such a hard justice state. But there you go. While searching for answers, of course, heads up, there is a certain amount of conjecture here, just a small amount, but the conjecture is fully supported by the materials related to the subject matter. I'll probably be going off on a lot of tangents because there's just a lot of things that connect in a lot of different ways, and my brain is wonky like that. So, as always, we have a lot to go over. So let's get started. My name is Jen Schaefer, and this is Crude X Season 3, Dean Corll and the Houston Mass Murders, The Syndicate, Part 2. Picture this. It's the 1970s, Houston, Texas, in an area of town called Montrose, which was/is Houston's own Haight-Ashbury or Greenwich Village. There you'll see gays of all sorts, punks, artists, musicians, and all their creative circles, super cool folks doing super cool things. And back then you'll see teenagers. Lots of them. Slender boys with shaggy hair, bell-bottoms, and tight-fitted band shirts trying their best to emulate their rock heroes. When I was at Lisa Olson's book reading, Murder by the Book in West University, Tim Leatherwood was there. He is the owner of Anderson Fair, and he reminisced about how crowded it was back in Montrose. There were just young people everywhere. It was just shoulder to shoulder. It was a place to see and a place to be seen. During the day, it was quite safe. It's sunny. It's hot. Lots of shops are open. Lots of places to shop, galleries to look at and to pop into. And it was just kind of an everyday sort of street. During the night, though, that's when its much darker side showed. Illegal narcotics and prostitution that included young people, both boys and girls. In our first season of Crude X, I told the story of a man named Bill List, who in the 1980s lured street boys from Montrose out to his mansion in Seabrook, where he physically and sexually abused them. Ultimately, Bill List faced retribution when some of the boys he victimized fought back and killed him. Doesn't that sound familiar? Here's the thing, though. When kids are lured into the world of prostitution, they're not just preyed on by local pimps or creeps in the shadows like Bill List. they are often lured into a world of big business. They become inventory for trafficking networks who uses them like consumables, serving them up to people, specifically men, in positions of power who have a lot of money and a lot of influence. The kids, in contrast, are typically from the other side of the tracks, often runaways, desperate to leave their situations, whether it's an abusive household or poverty or both. That desperation to escape their situation puts them directly in the hands of predators, who in turn feed them to a dark underbelly. Dean Corll's victims were all young men and boys. Most of them were from an area of Houston known as the Houston Heights, which is not too far from Montrose Boulevard. Nowadays, the Heights is expensive, with million-dollar homes and shiny new yoga studios and hip restaurants. But back in the 1970s, the Heights was a low-income area of town. It was an area that much of Houston, including the police, seemed to forget about. That apathy made it almost too easy for predators to set up shop. And one of them was Dean Corll. Theories suggest that Dean was connected to other men who did what he did to a syndicate, an organized crime type syndicate who specialized in the big business of trafficking boys. Come to find out, Houston was indeed a major hub for that. I went on a deep dive. I read a lot of books. And, you go on YouTube and you never know what you're going to find. But I found a little something that I almost skipped over, but, because it looks old. But I was like, you know what? I'm going to watch it. It was filmed in Austin back in the days. This show, it's 1981. And the show was called Alternative Views. And this was an episode titled Boys for Sale, Child Trafficking Rings in the United States. On the show, the host, there's two hosts, they speak with a very young Mark McKinnon, who I don't know if you know, he's a journalist. I think he's great. So they speak with Mark McKinnon, who's super young in this video, and a University of Texas professor named Dr. Tom Philpott. The show also features excerpts from a 1-hour documentary, also titled Boys for Sale, and that was filmed by two young guys named John Kells and David Galat, who at the time worked for ABC. They were producers. In their off hours, these dudes drove around the streets of Montrose, and they were meeting with homeless boys, and they were trying to help them find shelter, jobs, a way to get out of the life. What they discovered, though, was quite shocking. These boys that they were speaking with, many of them younger than 15, were being sex trafficked. So when they learned this, they decided to film it and interview the boys, and then they made a documentary of their findings. When Mark McKinnon and Dr. Tom Philpott heard about this documentary, they arranged a private screening of it, and from there they started their own investigation. And what they discovered, they shared on this show. And like I said, you can watch it for yourself on YouTube. It's a lot, but if you want to do your own research, there you go. I will give here a little bit of a summary of the things that I learned from the show. Boys for Sale was a vast enterprise with prostitution rings set up all over the United States. They worked like this. Clients could call them up, give them a credit card, and then that man could purchase a boy for the night. So these prostitution rings had a call service. And what they discovered was one call service, and they went over this in the show. They discovered a call service set up in New York City. And this call service had lines coming in from cities all over the United States with boys to, quote, entertain them in like a brothel type setting. So these cities that connected to this call service were Atlanta, New Orleans, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Houston. And the service had a list of over 10,000 clients across the U.S., on the show, they do kind of a mock phone call where they call and they kind of show you how it works. I wondered, of course, could there have been more call services like this? Like, was this just a huge hub in New York, or were there more? And come to find out, of course, there were more. I read about one. I just read this article. It was kind of like a off chance that I even found it. A lot of these articles they bury, by the way, and they'll talk about that on the show. But I found one, and it was about a call boy ring that was in Revere, Massachusetts. And it was called BUY FUCK. Okay. That was the name of the ring. And that was actually the name of the number that you dialed. BUY FUCK. It's 7 numbers. There you go. So you dialed that and you got the service, and it worked the same way as the one in New York. A man would call the number, request a boy, but this time he had to drive out to an apartment where he would find several underage boys who were minimally dressed, lounging around, watching TV and such. The man could then take his pick of a boy and then have his way with him, and then he'd leave. So this reporter found out that the guy in charge of this operation had a high-up police detective in his back pocket. He also discovered that a boy working for the ring got stabbed by one of his Johns, that it was super, super dangerous, and that this ring was never prosecuted. And many believe this Massachusetts ring was used to peddle both drugs and sex with underage boys, and that there was police involvement to cover it up. So there's that. Now, learning about these callboy services, it reminded me of an article I read about serial killer Dean Corll. So this is titled "The Horror Remains 20 Years Later, Memories of Dean Corll Haunt Survivor." It was written for the Houston Chronicle by a reporter named Evan Moore in 1993, and it centers around victim Rusty Branch's sister named Sue McElmore. In the article, Sue claimed that she and her brother Rusty, who was supposed to be kind of babysitting her at the time, would go to Dean Corll's apartment for his parties. She said at these parties were half-dressed young boys just kind of lounging everywhere, getting messed up on drugs, pot, huffing paint, so on. She stated she even saw a young boy do so many drugs that it looked like he overdosed, and Dean took the passed-out boy into his bedroom, and she never saw the boy again. Sue also remembered older men coming and going at these parties. She remembered 4 in particular who were there quite often. Police had her look at mugshots, and she identified 3 of the men. By that time, 2 of the men were already dead. A third one was in a Texas prison, convicted of sexual assault of a child, and then, of course, she couldn't remember the 4th man, so that was that. She told detectives, "I don't know what these guys knew about or what they did, but I do know that they were there in the bedroom with Dean a lot, and he never let me back there." So that's this article. And I've heard people on Reddit threads, whatever, dismiss it, saying the sister just wanted attention. But let me remind you, both Wayne and David emphasized in different interviews with the police that Dean Corll was involved in a sex trafficking / child exploitation material ring. We know that he had parties at the candy factory for teen boys. Dean's neighbors at the Westcott Towers were interviewed by the police after this happened with Dean, and they claimed to have seen teenagers going from his apartments all the time. This was just something that everyone knew. He had these parties, and boys would be there all the time. Now, we just learned about how these call boy services work. And it wouldn't be a stretch to assume that at Dean's many addresses, and I mean, there were over 24 known addresses for Dean Corll from 1968 to his death in 1973. 24 addresses. He moved around so much. And we know at his many parties that there were naked boys lounging around. And this very well could have just been a brothel-type business that he was running right under everyone's nose. In a Time magazine article titled "Child's Garden of Perversity," written April 4th, 1977, it stated pimps invited children to parties all the time. They'd invite them to parties, give them drugs, alcohol, whatever, and they would encourage them to enter into sexual acts while they photographed them. And then they circulated the pictures as advertisements to men seeking young sex partners. And frequently, the pictures are also sold to porn magazines. Now, that sounds exactly like what John David Norman, Guy Straight, Billy Byers, Francis Sheldon, it sounds like what they were all doing. Father Bud Boys Farm in Tennessee, geez, they were all doing this. So it's not hard to believe that Dean Corll was doing this. And of course, automatically you're like, well, why did he kill him? We'll go into that later. Just looking into it more, these boy brothels were not just in houses. In 1977, New York Times published an article that detailed the prostitution of boys that had a code name, by the way. We could use the code name too, so kind of just stick in your head. And the code name is called the chicken hawk trade. So specifically, the prostitution of boys back then was called the chicken hawk trade. Basically, the boys, the victims really, they're called the chickens, and the men who abuse them were called chicken hawks. So in this article, they stated men preyed on young boys in video arcades in Times Square. These arcades served as meeting spots for men to find underage boy prostitutes. These were also run like little brothels. In a Pepperdine University law review titled Preying on Playgrounds, that's P-R-E-Y, Preying on Playgrounds, it states California investigators found a 1972 pamphlet titled Where the Young Ones Are. And it listed places where children could be found for sex. Locations like bowling alleys, beaches, arcades, pool halls, and parks. They listed 378 places, 59 cities across 34 states. Legal and media reports from the time describe the pamphlet's contents and the arrest, but they don't mention the individual's name and they don't list the places. So it's hard to put that back together. And I couldn't find the pamphlet. But if I had to bet, Houston had some places listed. On the show Boys for Sale, Tom Philpott states it to be true. He said Houston was a major hub. It was just as bad as LA, Chicago, New York, but little is known about it because it was kept very quiet. In the documentary Boys for Sale, set in Houston, the documentarians interviewed several boys who were in the industry. One was a boy who stated he started prostituting at the age of 12. At age 16, he had been working for what he called, quote, a Houston corporation, who paid him and paid for the apartment he and other boys lived in. And they used the money to pay them from a well-covered-up slush fund. He said when the corporation's associates were in town, they were sent to his apartment, where he and the other underage boys he lived with would entertain them. He said they were into all kinds of perversions and that no two were the same. Another boy they interviewed corroborated that boy's story. He stated he also worked for an organization that he couldn't talk about for fear something bad would happen to him. In his words, he said that they'd kill him, slowly, breaking his fingers one by one, his toes, and then his ankles. He talked about how the organization was well protected and had vice in their back pocket. He talked about how they lured boys in to work for them. Many of the boys were runaways, hitchhikers. They'd pick them up, give them food and a place to stay, and then as payment for their generosity, they would, quote, put them to work. And then after that, the boys were stuck. If they didn't cooperate, they'd, in the words of the boy, they'd get rid of them. So these boys, he said, were as young as 9 years old. And to me, I don't know about you, but that sounds 100% like organized crime. For the boys, the victims of the chicken hawk trade, if the sexual abuse wasn't bad enough, the physical abuse could be even worse. According to Dr. Philpott, Houston, Texas was, quote, possibly the worst city in the United States for homeless boys and around 350 boys go missing or die each year. 31 boys alone died suspiciously in 1981. He told the story of a young boy named Jimmy, whose family moved to Houston from West Virginia. They were a poor family, no resources. Both parents ended up dying young, mom in a car accident and dad from alcoholism. So the boy, who was only 12 years old, had to fend for himself and for his little brother. He ends up prostituting himself regularly at an arcade in Houston. A few years later, his body was found. They didn't say where, but they did say that he had been murdered and his body had been mutilated. I don't know who this boy was. I couldn't find anything further about it, but that is the story that Tom Philpott tells. In another interview for Boys for Sale, a 15-year-old talked about a time when a man lured him to his place for beer and to smoke a joint. The boy said after only one beer, he got really dizzy. He passed out, and when he came to, he was tied up, and the man tortured him while he cried. After the boy gave that interview to the documentarians, months later, his mutilated body was found by police in Missouri. But this boy was from Houston, and they interviewed him in Houston. There was very little protection for these boys. I say was, I think is. There is very little protection for kids that end up in this industry. Everyone mistreated them. The pimps, for lack of a better word, the Johns, the customers, they were just abused for a sick fetish. And it seems some of the boys were even killed by them. It also seems that even systems set up to protect them failed them. And we went over a slew of nonprofits that these men created to just sex traffic these boys. On our last episode, we talked how the pedo magazines and newsletters taught their members how to infiltrate legitimate nonprofits and organizations, churches, schools, youth groups. We learned that nonprofits were not just set up to abuse them, it was set up for like tax shelters. So they were making money off the government while they were abusing these boys. In Texas in the 1970s, the Texas Youth Council state schools were under investigation for abuse, particularly Gatesville and Mountain View, and these were both located near Fort Hood, and they were sued in a class action lawsuit for the allegations of abuse. Then I read about Cal Farley's Boys Ranch that was based near Amarillo. They also faced allegations of extensive abuse, including sexual abuse by staff members and, of course, the older boys, and this is from 1950s into the 1990s. And then there's a case that Tom Philpott brought up, and I couldn't find anything about this either, but I still feel like I need to talk about it. He talked about a Texas congressman who ran a boys' home and allowed contributors campaign spend time with these boys that stayed at his home. So I don't know about that one. I couldn't find anything, but you can definitely find things on the other stories that I just told you. That is all, of course, just the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more going on. And the question is, of course, why is it that in Houston, Texas, that all of this was going on and nothing was being done about it? Well, according to Dr. Tom Philpott, that's for a couple of reasons. One, most of the individual customers were prominent individuals, family men, men who were, quote, the pillars of our society, and they were covering up for that. But there's a second reason, and I think this is probably the bigger reason, in my opinion. The business of callboy services, the chicken hawk trade, remember, chicken hawk. The chicken hawk trade, if you will, it was an adjunct of, quote, clean business. And in Texas, the ties ran deep and the money ran even deeper, and there's deeper connections from that clean business to, of course, dirty business. So enter in the money men and the big banks in Texas. So on Boys for Sale, journalist Mike McKinnon went over a story about a boy prostitution ring that was discovered in Austin, Texas. There was this pharmacist who was hanging around schools, and he would offer drugs and money to lure boys in for sexual favors. And we can assume more than likely he was filming it and producing child porn the way that all the others were set up. Well, when police raided his home, they found a file of 200 to 500 cards with names of boys on them. They were from the Travis County area. The cards had boys' height, weight, age, sexual preferences, and even drug preferences. They also found the names of several prominent businessmen in Texas. But just like they did with John David Norman's Odyssey Foundation bust in Dallas in 1973, all the evidence from the raid was conveniently lost. And the pharmacist, who was initially arrested and incarcerated for a short time, he got out, he skipped the country, and he was never seen again. Doesn't that sound familiar? But according to Mark McKinnon, that wasn't the end of the story. One of the items also found at the pharmacist's apartment during the raid was a checkbook that had a student's name and address on it. He tracked them down and discovered the kid's father was head of one of the biggest banks in Dallas. So this, of course, piqued his interest, and while investigating it further, he was contacted by the head of the Texas Rangers, who gave him a short, cryptic demand: forget Dallas. He said that, and he quickly hung up, and that was that. The investigation into the pedophile pharmacist, his sex trafficking ring, and the owner of that checkbook belonging to a Dallas banker's son ended abruptly. They couldn't pursue it any further. So Mark McKinnon didn't elaborate further on the show, but this was also right at the time when it was happening, and I'm sure he didn't want any repercussions from it, so he just told what he could. But that was then, this is now, and looking into it, it's not hard to comprise a short list of who those folks could have been. With what little we know from his story, we're just going to kind of fill in the blanks like a crazy Mad Libs. So let's just kind of work our way backwards. We know that a Texas Ranger called him and told him to forget Dallas. So I think that that Texas Ranger who called him was more than likely James B. Adams. This man served in the FBI for nearly 30 years before becoming DPS director in the late 70s. He rose through the ranks under J. Edgar Hoover. And this is a name that will keep coming up, by the way. And I know that's like conspiracy theory 101 to include J. Edgar Hoover, but it's true. He was connected, of course, to the Dallas Money Men, right? And those money men included Billy Byers Sr., who his son was Billy Byers Jr., who I talked about on our last episode, who was involved in child pornography and sex trafficking. And this is why I bring J. Edgar Hoover up. It really comes to Billy Byers, okay? In Anthony Summers' 1993 book, Official and Confidential, The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover, he talks about Hoover's sexcapades, if you will, with underage boys and his connection to Billy Byers Jr. Now, remember, this guy was partners with Guy Strait, who was a big-time child pornographer and a big-time sex trafficker who was connected to John David Norman, who in Dallas had the Odyssey Foundation. So see how it all comes around. So it makes sense that Texas Ranger Adams, also close to Hoover, could have played a hand in redirecting investigations when you've got someone like Billy Byers Jr. coming up in the mix. Billy Byers Sr., though, wasn't a banker, so he was an oil man. So who could the banker have been, right? He was tight with Dallas elites like Clint Murchison, who was also very, very close with J. Edgar Hoover. The Murchisons had a hotel, Del Charro Hotel, that hosted J. Edgar Hoover and all his lascivious affairs. Just a reminder, the Murchisons were close friends with Billy Byers, whatever. So we've got Billy Byers, the Murchisons. You've got J. Edgar Hoover, they're all hanging out, they're all chummy. Murchison's partner was a man named Toddy Lee Wynn. At the time this all went down with the pharmacist and the trafficking ring, Toddy Lee's sons, Toddy Lee Wynn Jr., was the director of First Republic Bank Incorporated, one of the biggest banks in Dallas. This man was also a minority shareholder and original founder of the Dallas Cowboys Football Club, who he owned with Clint Murchison's son, Clint Murchison Jr. Interestingly enough, the Wynns owned a private island, Matagorda Island, and oddly enough, Wynn's son was at UT Austin during the time that this all occurred. So there's that one. I know it kind of takes a minute to get there, but it always has key players. If you keep listening up, it always has the key players. Another big Dallas banker and another name that kept coming up in my research was a man named Robert Anderson. He was a prominent lawyer and politician. He was also close friends with Clint Murchison and Billy Byers Sr. He served in President Eisenhower's cabinet during the time of J. Edgar Hoover, so he was tight with J. Edgar Hoover. Between 1983 and 85, Anderson, with his partner, David B. Gould, illegally operated the Commercial Exchange Bank and Trust located in the British West Indies, and this bank laundered large amounts of cash for major drug traffickers. We all know that sex trafficking and drug trafficking often go hand in hand. Anderson also had a couple sons. One of them also went to UT Austin. So that's Dallas. Sorry, Texas Ranger guy, it's not forgotten. And sorry, I'm not sorry. But that's kind of that story. Any of them being connected to the Austin pharmacist is, of course, conjecture. I'm going to admit that. But when you have law enforcement at the highest level unwilling to investigate it, that is the best we can do so far. But these threads are based on theories that are based on facts. It's just how they all come together. If we keep pressing on, we learn that Dallas banks weren't the only ones acting suspiciously. According to UT professor Dr. Tom Philpott, when the documentary Boys for Sale was set to air on ABC, the biggest bank in Houston threatened to withdraw their advertising money from the news program and the station itself. They also threatened to convince other banks to follow suit if they aired the show. Tom Philpott did not mention the name of this bank. But again, let's do the same thing and look at a couple of banks it could have been just by looking into who were the biggest banks at the time. One of the biggest banks in Houston was Central Bank. This bank was originally Montrose National Bank of Houston. Their original address was in a building off 3400 Montrose Boulevard. Now, straight away, that address holds some major significance. Back in the 90s, at the top of the building, there used to be Scott Gertner Sky Bar. I went there. Most of my friends went there. It was a jazz music club. Super fun. A nice spot for live music. Rest in peace, Scott Gertner. He left us not that long ago. So that was in the 90s. But what I didn't know was back in the 1970s, that same spot was a gay nightclub called The Palace. Now, here's the thing. This nightclub was mentioned in a handful of police reports regarding the Dean Corll murders. One report was an interview with an informant named McCracken, who was a regular at the Palace. He worked for a business called All American Amusement Shows. Well, he and a friend, who was a booking agent for musicians, met up with Dean Corll in the parking lot of a Sears in Pasadena. He said that they talked about stereo equipment and how to make a bong out of a gas mask, and he thought that his friend and Dean had a little thing. He also stated, this guy McCracken, that he regularly played pool at the Bank Shot Pool Hall, which was also a regular hangout for Corll's victims, as well as Henley and Brooks. Now, remember, the victims of Dean Corll hung out at places like this all the time, like they were at pool halls, a bowling alley, a community pool, skating rink. Dean often took the boys to the beach and photographed them. Just like that pamphlet that was discovered said, these are places where you can meet underage boys. Dean has that checklist. So there's that. Another police report regarding the palace was an interview with a guy who worked at the palace. And he was at school at University of Houston. This guy claimed to be close friends with Wayne Henley. He said he taught him how to fight and how to shoot a gun. I've read a lot of Reddit threads about the Houston mass murders, and many suggest that Henley, as well as some of the other victims, used to hustle at the palace. So hustling is like a whole thing. While looking up more about the palace, I stumbled across a collection of gay literature from the 70s. Most were magazines with advertisements, events that were happening around Houston, and of course some eye candy for those who were looking, but it was adults seeking adults. It wasn't boys. These magazines even had articles addressing all the problems that the gay community was facing, so homophobic laws and harassment. And there was even articles about dealing with hustlers and how to spot them. So yeah, hustlers was a thing. The line between the victims of sex trafficking and hustlers is a very thin one. So the hustlers took advantage of gay men at bars. They would lure them in and lie and steal from them. And these boy hustlers were of all ages. They were kind of like the Oliver Twist of the prostitution underbelly. All of it was dangerous, of course, and all the boys, no matter what, of course, were groomed by someone into doing this. And so at the end of the day, they are victims. But that's kind of what was happening at the time, and that was happening a lot at the palace. So while looking through these legit gay publications, I eventually came across a sketchy one. And it was a 1970 copy of a magazine called Gay Boy Magazine. And in it, they had a photo shoot at the Palace nightclub. The picture showed the inside of the club. It's very opulent, and a couple of very young-looking guys. One of them was kind of the featured guy of the spread, and he had a little write-up. He stated that he just turned 18, and he said that he was from Sunset Beach, California, and that he hung out at a bar called The Stables, which, side note, that was a gay bar in LA that serial killer Randy Kraft used to work and pick up his victims. So that's just weird. It's just weird that that was mentioned while I'm looking into Dean Corll stuff. To get even weirder, the back pages of Gay Boy Magazine featured a coupon for a Super 8 film called Teenage Masturbation. Gross. Some of the pictures are very graphic, so heads up if you do your own research and you look into something, just if you look into that, heads up, graphic photos. So here's a little bit about Gay Boy Magazine and kind of looked into who put this out. It was issued by Anico Publishing in Montrose, and it was headed up by a few men named Joseph and Mike Anthony. It's a father-son duo who owned several adult bookstores in the area. They also owned Anthony Studios. There was another man involved named Ray Houston of K&R Studios. K&R Studios' address was right outside of Brenham, Texas, the same area where Guy Strait and Billy Byers Jr. shot the underage boy pornographic film called Sandy Hill. In Barbara Gibson's book, she has a chapter dedicated to Brenham, Texas. Investigators were led there during their investigation of Dean Corll. One of Corll's victims even told his mother he was going to Brenham with some boys the day he went missing. So that's a little bit about the Palace nightclub at 3400 Montrose Boulevard that at one time was the same address of Montrose National Bank of Houston. So we're getting back to the banks. That was just a little side note because, like I said, when I have these automatic ties into things, I've just got to say it. So Montrose National Bank of Houston eventually became Central Bank in the 1970s. They moved to downtown Houston. It became one of the biggest banks in Houston. And in 1973, it was headed up by a prominent Houstonian businessman named Jack Josie. So this guy, he was, like all the others, deeply connected. He was connected to Governor John Connolly. He was part of a group of men called the River Okies. a clique of rich men who essentially ran Houston. They were all part of the River Oaks Country Club. River Oaks is a very rich, famously rich for decades and decades area of Houston. So you've got this man heading up this bank. This bank was one of the biggest banks in Houston. Biggest bank of Houston pulled their funding from ABC for Boys for Sale. So that's one bank that you could look at and wonder, was it them that pulled the funding? There's another bank that I'd like to mention, and that's First City National Bank of Houston. This bank was founded by James Elkins, who's a lawyer and deeply involved in the oil industry. His son, James Elkins Jr., served as the director for major corporations like American General, Cameron Iron Works, Eastern Airlines, yada yada. What's interesting is when you start to connect people, there's a lot of juniors. Like, it's Billy Barnes Jr. So many juniors, man. So I don't know. This guy, James Elkins Jr., he was head of First City National Bank of Houston. His scandals, by the way, were financial ones, risky lending. He was part of the savings and loan crisis in the 1980s that I think is all linked to drugs. And he was part of the Enron scandal. So this guy has a little bit of a sketchy history. And then he was also head of this bank. Hard times leads to bad decisions, I get it. But if he's part of this bank and they pull their funding for Boys for Sale, it makes you wonder. James Elkins Sr. and Jr., by the way, were part of the Suite 8F group. And that's a powerful collection of wealthy Houston businessmen and politicians who met in Suite 8F of the Lamar Hotel in downtown Houston. In the mid-20th century, these men had a lot of influence on Texas and national politics. Suite 8F was even dubbed the secret capital of Texas. Members of this group included members of the Houston rich, but also the Dallas rich. And it had politicians like Lyndon B. Johnson and John Connolly. Members of Suite 8F group were also prominent River Okies, like Jack Josie of Central Bank. So it's easy to see that these banks kind of played together. Central Bank, First City National Bank of Houston, they were connected through business, they were connected through politics. So if one says, I'm going to pull my funding, I'm going to get my friends to do it, then you can see what they meant by that. Now, we don't know for a fact that these are the banks that did it, but these are just the biggest banks in Houston. And that's kind of why I think if they were the ones who pulled funding, that would be why they did it. It was because of the documentary Boys for Sale. But who are they covering for? Like, let's say they did it. Let's say that these banks were the ones who are like the biggest bank in Dallas who's got the Texas Rangers to stop the investigation. And then you've got these big banks that are like, hey, if you show this show about these boys and this epidemic that's going on in Houston, we're going to pull our funding. Why would they do that? So, I guess come to find out, the big bank men were just not the only ones trying to stop the investigations. So when you know that, the chicken hawk industry, a lot of people were looking into it, and the bank men were not only the ones trying to stop it. The show Boys for Sale interviewed a representative. His name was Ralph Wallace. He was a member of the Texas House of Representatives, representing Houston from 1977 to 1992. So in 77, straight away, he became the chairman of the House Select Committee on Child Pornography. This committee was set to conduct an in-depth study. They're going to take testimonies. They're trying to develop legislation to prevent the production, distribution of child exploitation materials, figure out who these players were, take them down. That was their goal. After only 2 public hearings, the committee's budget was slashed from $80,000 to $15,000. And he said that made it very difficult for them to function and to conduct their research. Wallace stated he believes that it's because he discovered that there was a huge problem in Houston and that he was told to back off by high-up officials. Now, we can assume that they're just covering up for individuals, those pillars of society, those individual men right? You can think that, and I'm sure that's probably true for some of them. But I also think that there's a lot more to it. What I think is they were covering up for organized crime. And I think that the depths of it went very far and very wide. I think that that's who these prominent bankers were connected to. I think that's who these politicians were tied to. And I think that I can at least prove that they were. And we can discover more how Dean Corll was also connected to this whole thing. I think we realize now that it's very safe to say that he was running brothels. It just made sense that he was part of this group. They found Odyssey Foundation literature at his house, supposedly. It's what I've read several places, but I don't know that for a fact. But he was a part of these people. He was connected to them. They were all connected to each other. I think he was one of those people that men looking for this type of thing could connect with. I think that he had brothels out of his apartment. He was running. I think it was more than just him being a serial killer. And I think that it was connected to organized crime. So I have a lot to say about that. And what we're going to go ahead and do is talk about that on our next episode, because I'm looking at the time and we are out of it. So stay tuned, because this is when we're going to get really into the goings on and what I think was happening. Like I said, I'm going to back this all up and you'll see what I'm talking about. Until then, keep questioning everything and not taking the easy answers when you do. Break free from manipulations. There's a lot of manipulating out there. Call shit out even when people hate you for it. In this case, it's for the sake of our kids. It's for the sake of girls and boys. We need to keep them safe. And I don't care if it makes you mad when I talk about it. And I know that you guys feel the same way. Remember your values, uphold them with a vengeance, and a big thank you for all of you who support me in doing just that. You know who you are. I thank you all the time. Before I go, there's a documentary that just dropped on HBO Max or ID Network. It's wherever you can watch it. It's about Wayne Henley, and it's called The Serial Killer's Apprentice. It's based on Catherine Ramsland's book that is also named the same. It goes over some things that we've touched on in this season. So go check that out, see what you think. Come back and see us next time, because we're about to tell y'all a bunch of stuff. So take care. Bye-bye.